At 1 minute past midnight on August 19th, a new 50% tariff is scheduled to land on nearly $20 billion of Canadian goods entering the United States. And as of this recording, nobody in Ottawa or Washington can say with certainty whether that deadline will actually be stopped in time. This is not a hypothetical threat anymore. It is a signed proclamation sitting on the books with a clock running underneath it. And the products on that list are almost deliberately symbolic of the two countries' shared history. Wine, hockey sticks, cement. Everyday goods turned into instruments of economic pressure between two nations that, until recently, treated their 4,000-mile border as little more than a formality. For most of the past 3 decades, the economic relationship between these two countries was treated almost as a given. The original North American Free Trade Agreement, later renegotiated during Trump's first term into the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, built a supply chain so integrated that a single automobile part could cross the Windsor-Detroit border several times before ever reaching a finished vehicle. Canadian steel fed American factories. American machinery equipped Canadian mills. Energy flowed south. Manufactured goods flowed both directions. And for a generation, the border functioned more like an internal state line than an international boundary. That is the baseline this current showdown is measured against. Not a normal trading relationship under strain, but arguably the most integrated bilateral economic partnership on Earth, now absorbing tariff shocks it was never structurally designed to withstand. To understand how a trading relationship this close ended up here, you have to go back to February 1st, 2025, the day Donald Trump first announced sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods after returning to the White House. That original package included a 25% tariff on most Canadian imports and a 10% tariff specifically targeting Canadian energy products. Canada did not sit still. Ottawa answered with retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods, and within 3 weeks, that retaliation had escalated to cover a staggering $155 billion in U.S. products. What had been, for decades, one of the most integrated economic partnerships on Earth was suddenly a trade war, with both governments hitting each other's industries in a tit-for-tat spiral that neither side seemed eager to de-escalate. That spiral did not stay contained to blanket tariffs. Over the following months, the Trump administration layered on sector-specific measures under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, 25% on automobiles, 10% on lumber, and 25% on wooden furniture. Each of these hit different regions of Canada in different ways, which is part of why this fight became so politically complicated. Steel and autos are Ontario's story. Aluminum and dairy are Quebec's story. Lumber and forest products are British Columbia's story. A single national trade policy in Washington was landing as several distinct regional crises across Canada simultaneously, and that regional texture still shapes the negotiations happening in Ottawa today. By late summer 2025, there were signs of a partial thaw. According to reporting from NBC News, Canada dropped many of its retaliatory tariffs on the United States at the start of September that year, following what Prime Minister Mark Carney's office described as a productive and wide-ranging phone call with President Trump. Well, a White House official told NBC News at the time that Canada's move was, in their words, long overdue. Carney framed the decision differently, telling reporters that Canada believed it already had the best trade arrangement of any country negotiating with Washington, and that his government's focus going forward would be squarely on what he called the strategic sectors: steel, aluminum, autos, and forestry. That calm did not hold. On October 23rd, 2025, Trump announced a halt to trade negotiations with Canada altogether. 2 days later, on October 25th, he declared a 10% increase to the tariff rate charged on Canadian goods. The relationship kept lurching between escalation and negotiation through the winter, and then came a moment that briefly looked like relief. On February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court ruled that President Trump could not use emergency economic powers to impose certain tariffs, a decision that opened the door to reversing many of the levies put in place during 2025. For a few days, businesses on both sides of the border allowed themselves to believe the worst of the trade war might be behind them. It was not. Just 2 days after that Supreme Court ruling on February 22nd, Trump posted on Truth Social that he planned to raise a newly announced tariff rate from 10% to 15%. The new 10% tariffs he had announced took effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern on February 24th, regardless, covering a 150-day window. CNN's Elizabeth Buchwald later described the pattern plainly. Trump's 50% tariff on Canada, announced in July, marked one of the steepest duties to take effect since the Supreme Court had struck down his broadest tariff authority, and CNN's analysis framed it as a warning shot aimed not just at Ottawa, but at every other country that assumed the court's ruling had permanently reduced its own tariff risk. Then came the trigger for the current crisis. In early July 2026, Trump warned Canada that he might impose severe new tariffs over wildfire smoke that had drifted south across the border into the United States. An unusual, and for many trade analysts, an unprecedented justification for a tariff threat. Just over a week later, on July 20th, 2026, the administration followed through, invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. According to a press release from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, this was the first recorded use of Section 338 in nearly a century, and it authorized 50% additional tariffs on a specific basket of Canadian goods, deliberately structured to apply regardless of whether those goods qualified for exemption under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, known in Canada as CUSMA. That is the legal foundation of the showdown now facing Ottawa. The White House's own fact sheet on the measure states plainly that these Section 338 tariffs apply to all covered goods, no matter their country of origin compliance status under the existing free trade framework, a notable departure, since USMCA compliant goods had generally been shielded from earlier rounds of tariffs. According to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, the newly covered goods represent close to $20 billion in annual imports from Canada, which is where the figure at the center of this story, Canada's $20 billion showdown, actually comes from. It is not a slogan. It is the Trade Representative's own estimate of what is now exposed. Al Jazeera's breakdown of the measure, published in the days after the announcement, described the tariffs as covering a range of items including wine, hockey sticks, and cement, according to a White House fact sheet distributed at the time. The report noted that the White House justified the move by pointing to what it called discriminatory treatment from Ottawa against American alcohol, automobile, and dairy products. Notably, the new duties do not apply to oil, gas, critical minerals, or potash, and they do not stack on top of goods already covered by the earlier sector-specific tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos. This is a targeted strike on a defined slice of the Canadian export economy, not a blanket embargo. But for the industries caught inside that slice, 50% is a devastating number. CBS News, in an interview with Ontario Premier Doug Ford published around the same time, reported that the list of covered goods actually runs wider than the headline items suggest, including down feathers, hockey equipment, milk, honey, and alcohol, alongside wine and cement. Ford told CBS News that Canada did not start this trade war, and pointed out that retaliatory tariffs, in his words, hurt the population of both countries rather than just one side. Ford has been one of the most visible and combative provincial voices throughout this entire dispute, at one point imposing a 25% surcharge on electricity Ontario exports to the United States and pulling American liquor off provincial shelves during an earlier round of tariffs, measures that were later wound back as part of Canada's broader rollback of retaliatory tariffs in September of 2025. The dispute also spilled into an unusually symbolic piece of shared infrastructure. According to CBS News, Canada this month rescinded its invitations to American officials to attend the long-awaited opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, the new crossing connecting Windsor, Ontario, with Detroit, Michigan, a project decades in the planning that was meant to symbolize exactly the kind of cross-border cooperation this trade war has spent the past 18 months undermining. Trump, for his part, used Truth Social around the same time to criticize Canada over both the trade dispute and the bridge itself, according to CBS News reporting, underscoring just how far this fight has spread beyond tariff schedules and into the everyday symbols of the two countries' relationship. It is worth noting that not every voice in Canada agrees retaliation is even the right strategy, regardless of how this particular deadline resolves. An economic analysis published by The Hub, a Canadian policy outlet, argued that Ottawa's best response to the latest round of tariffs might actually be to do nothing at all when it comes to retaliation specifically, citing data showing that Canada is not, in fact, uniquely singled out among America's trading partners. Once you look across the roughly 51,000 tariff lines the United States now applies worldwide. That analysis acknowledged that many Canadian steel and aluminum products already face 50% tariffs, with more set to join them on August 19th, but argued that matching retaliation dollar for dollar could end up costing Canadian consumers more than it costs American exporters. That is one economist's contested argument, not a consensus position. Public opinion data cited in the same piece found that roughly 3 in 4 Canadians, early in the trade war, supported Ottawa retaliating with tariffs of its own, and provincial premiers, Ford chief among them, have continued pushing for tougher countermeasures rather than restraint. Why 50%, and why now? The White House fact sheet lays out its own version of events. It states that the United States, under President Trump's leadership, chose not to renew the USMCA in its current form, describing the existing deal as insufficiently beneficial to American interests. The fact sheet also points to trade figures. It says, justify the pressure campaign From April 2025 through March 2026, Canadian imports of American motor vehicles fell by roughly 22%, or $5.6 billion, compared to the same period a year earlier. From March 2025 through February 2026, Canadian imports of American alcoholic beverages collapsed by about 81%, or $582 million, a figure the administration attributes directly to the provincial boycotts and Buy Canadian campaigns that swept the country after the trade war began. The White House also singled out Canada's dairy system, describing tariff rate quotas on American cheese as far more restrictive than the quotas Canada extends to cheese imports from the European Union, despite Canada holding trade agreements with both blocs. And in a line that frames the entire dispute as more than just an economic dispute, the fact sheet notes that over the past year and a half, only two countries chose to retaliate against President Trump's tariffs rather than negotiate a settlement with Washington: the People's Republic of China and Canada. Whether or not you accept that framing, it tells you plainly how the administration sees Ottawa's position, not as a reluctant negotiating partner, but as one of only two governments in the world still actively pushing back. Canada's own account of the same period tells a different story, one shaped as much by domestic politics as by trade economics. The trade war coincided with and helped fuel what has been documented as a broad Canadian boycott of American goods and travel that began on February 1st, 2025, and, according to reporting compiled by researchers tracking the movement, has continued for well over a year since. That boycott's stated motives were twofold: retaliation against the tariffs themselves, and a push to strengthen domestic Canadian production and interprovincial trade so the country would be less exposed to American economic pressure in the future. Its documented effects include a sharp drop in Canadian travel to the United States and a measurable increase in Canadian consumer preference for domestic products. Effects that, ironically, the White House later cited as evidence of Canadian discrimination against American goods. That is the backdrop against which the current, far more urgent phase of this story is unfolding in Ottawa this week. With the August 19th deadline bearing down, Reuters reported on August 13th that a Canadian government source directly familiar with the negotiations said talks were progressing well, and that Washington also wanted an agreement in place before the new tariff deadline hit. According to that Reuters report, Dominic LeBlanc, the Canadian minister responsible for Canada-U.S. relations, met with U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer for the second time that week alone, their fourth meeting in 3 weeks. LeBlanc posted on X that negotiations were ongoing, and that Canada continued to advance its interests, while the unnamed government source told Reuters that, in their words, "What I'm seeing right now in terms of the negotiations, it seems to go quite well." But optimism from one side of a negotiating table rarely tells the whole story, and Prime Minister Carney's own public language has been notably more guarded. Speaking to reporters in Quebec, as reported by Global News, Carney said Canada is pursuing what he called a more comprehensive, more global deal that addresses the country's strategic sectors, rather than a narrow agreement covering only a handful of products. Asked directly whether that broader deal would be ready by August 19th, Carney's answer was simple: "We'll see." He added that Canada wants to build pathways toward that comprehensive outcome even if the full agreement isn't locked in by the deadline itself, language that leaves real room for the tariffs to take effect even amid active good faith talks. CBC News reported on similar comments from earlier in August, when Carney told reporters he was very involved personally in the negotiations happening in Washington, and that Canadian negotiators were focused on what he called all strategic sectors, explicitly including the automotive industry. That same CBC report noted that the Globe and Mail had cited multiple sources describing discussions between the two countries over steel and aluminum export quotas as a possible mechanism to lower U.S. tariffs in those sectors. But two separate government sources told CBC News directly that this quota framework did not reflect the actual state of negotiations at that time. That is a genuine point of disagreement between outlets citing different sources, and it is worth flagging honestly rather than presenting either version as settled fact. The Globe and Mail's own reporting, published just days before the deadline, laid out what both sides are said to be pursuing in what negotiators are reportedly calling an interim agreement, a deal in which Canada would concede to a long list of American demands in exchange for partial relief from Trump's tariffs. According to sources cited by the Globe, those demands reportedly include Canada dropping all of its remaining retaliatory tariffs on the United States, including those still in place on American-made autos, provincial governments ending their bans on the sale of American alcohol and winding down official Buy Canadian procurement policies, and Ottawa agreeing to Washington's interpretation of how licenses for Canada's supply-managed dairy sector should be allocated going forward. That provincial dimension is, according to the Globe and Mail's reporting, the single biggest complication standing between Ottawa and a finished deal. Carney does not simply need to satisfy Washington. He needs to bring Canada's premiers along with him, and each premier is defending a different regional economy with a different stake in the outcome. Ontario is exposed through its automotive and steel industries. Quebec is exposed through aluminum production and its politically sensitive dairy sector. British Columbia is exposed through forestry and lumber, an industry already reeling from existing tariffs. Asking all three provinces to simultaneously drop protective measures their voters have rallied behind for over a year is, by any political measure, an extraordinarily difficult sell. And it is precisely the kind of internal negotiation that can quietly sink a deal even after the international terms look close to settled. There is also the personnel story unfolding behind the scenes, and it matters more than it might first appear. The Globe and Mail reported that Dominic LeBlanc had been scheduled to fly back to Washington on a Monday to continue talks, but that his plane was turned back to Montreal because of weather, forcing a delay at a moment when every day counts. LeBlanc has effectively been leading Canada's side of the negotiations because Prime Minister Carney spent part of the week on a personal trip to Italy. Though Carney's office told the Globe he remained in regular contact with his negotiating team throughout, and he was expected to return to Canada on August 17th, giving him roughly 48 hours of direct involvement before the deadline arrives. Brian Clow, a former Deputy Chief of Staff and Canada U, Relations Advisor under previous Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, told the Globe and Mail that the very fact these negotiations have continued this intensively, right up against the deadline, is itself notable. A sign that both governments still see enough value in reaching an agreement to keep talking rather than simply letting the tariffs land and dealing with the fallout afterward. That is an analyst's interpretation, not a confirmed fact about what either government intends, and it should be understood as one experienced observer's read on the situation, rather than as inside knowledge of what Trump or Carney will ultimately decide. Not every voice close to the situation is convinced a deal will materialize at all, and some of the skepticism comes from surprising places. According to reporting referenced by the Globe and Mail, Anthony Scaramucci, a former brief member of the first Trump administration, has predicted publicly that Trump will, in the internet shorthand that has followed the president through much of his second term, taco on the tariff threat against Canada, meaning back down or delay rather than actually let the 50% duties take effect as scheduled. That prediction is Scaramucci's own opinion, explicitly presented as such, and it should not be mistaken for a confirmed leak from inside the White House. But it reflects a broader pattern that has repeated itself throughout this trade war. Deadlines get announced with maximum drama, and then, more often than not, they get delayed, softened, or partially walked back at the last moment. That pattern is worth sitting with for a second because it has happened before with this exact set of tariffs. Trump originally told Canada, in a letter posted to his social media platform in early July of 2025, that 35% tariffs would take effect on August 1st of that year. According to the BBC's reporting at the time, that letter was one of more than 20 similar letters Trump sent to U.S. trade partners within a single week, alongside additional threats of blanket 15 to 20% tariffs on most other countries, and a promise of new tariffs targeting the European Union. Carney's response then was nearly identical to his tone now. Canada, he said, would continue to protect its workers and businesses and would not accept a deal simply for the sake of reaching one. Our objective is not to reach a deal whatever it costs, Carney told reporters in Ontario at the time, according to the BBC. We are pursuing a deal that will be in the best interest of Canadians. The BBC's coverage also captured just how exposed Canada is in this fight, structurally, regardless of who is negotiating. Canada sends roughly 3/4 of all its exported goods to the United States, and it functions as a major auto manufacturing hub and a critical supplier of metals into the American industrial supply chain, which is exactly why tariffs aimed at Canada land so hard, so fast, on both sides of the border. It is also why American automakers and manufacturers, who rely on integrated supply chains that cross the border sometimes, several times, before a finished vehicle rolls off the line, have quietly lobbied against some of these tariffs, even as the White House frames them as protective of American industry. On the scale of the broader economic relationship, the numbers behind this fight are genuinely enormous. The White House itself has cited a U.S. goods trade deficit with Canada of $46.4 billion in 2025, attributing the bulk of that gap to Canadian oil and gas exports into the American market. Sectors that, notably, remain exempt from the newest round of Section 338 tariffs. That exemption is not an accident. Energy trade between the two countries runs deep, with American refineries in the Midwest built specifically to process Canadian crude, and cutting that flow off would likely raise fuel prices for American consumers almost immediately. It is one of the clearest examples in this entire dispute of Washington drawing a tariff line specifically to avoid a policy that would hurt American voters as much as it hurts Ottawa. There is a separate, more technical point worth understanding if you want to follow how badly the August 19th tariffs could actually bite. According to Canadian financial data cited by NerdWallet, roughly 94% of the goods Canada ships to the United States already comply with CUSMA rules of origin, meaning only about 6% of Canadian exports fall outside that protected category under normal circumstances. What makes the Section 338 tariffs unusual, and unusually threatening to Ottawa, is that the White House's own fact sheet confirms these specific new duties apply regardless of CUSMA compliance status, deliberately reaching past the exemption that has shielded the vast majority of Canadian trade throughout this entire 2-year conflict. So where does that leave things as of this recording, with the deadline now just days away? The honest answer is that this is genuinely unresolved. Multiple credible outlets, Reuters, The Globe and Mail, Global News, CBC, and Bloomberg among them, are reporting real, active, intensifying negotiations between Ottawa and Washington, with meetings happening multiple times a week, and both governments publicly signaling they would prefer a deal over letting the tariffs land. But not one of those outlets has reported that a final agreement has actually been signed, and Prime Minister Carney himself, as recently as this past week, was still telling reporters, "We'll see," when asked point blank whether a deal would be ready in time. Anyone telling you with total confidence right now exactly how this ends is going further than the evidence currently supports. What we can say with confidence is how we got here, and that history matters for understanding whatever happens next. This is not an isolated dispute over hockey sticks and wine. It is the latest chapter in a trade relationship that has swung from crisis to partial thaw to renewed crisis at least 4 distinct times since February of 2025. First, with the original blanket tariffs, then with Canada's partial retaliatory rollback, then with the Supreme Court's ruling and its immediate reversal by new tariff announcements, and now with this Section 338 escalation triggered at least in part by a dispute over wildfire smoke. Each cycle has followed a similar shape: an aggressive American move, a period of Canadian resistance and retaliation, intense last-minute negotiation, and then either a partial deal or a deadline that simply passes with the tariffs taking effect as scheduled. If the tariffs do take effect on August 19th without a deal, the immediate effects would fall hardest on a specific, identifiable slice of the Canadian economy: wine producers, particularly in Ontario and British Columbia, who already absorbed the shock of the 81% collapse in the reverse direction when Canadians boycotted American alcohol, cement manufacturers whose product is heavy, low margin, and especially sensitive to added cost at the border, and hockey stick manufacturers, a genuinely small but symbolically loaded Canadian industry that has become an odd but recurring feature of this trade war's news coverage, precisely because it captures in miniature how personal and almost absurd these disputes can feel, even as billions of dollars move around them. If, instead, Ottawa and Washington strike the interim agreement reportedly being discussed, Canada would be giving up a great deal to get there. Dropping all remaining retaliatory tariffs on American autos would remove one of Canada's few remaining points of direct leverage. Ending provincial alcohol bans and Buy Canadian procurement rules would unwind political commitments provincial governments made under public pressure, commitments many premiers used to demonstrate they were standing up for Canadian workers, and conceding to Washington's preferred interpretation of Canada's dairy licensing system would touch one of the most politically protected sectors in Canadian agriculture, an industry that has resisted foreign pressure to open its market for decades under both Liberal and Conservative governments alike. That is precisely why Carney has repeatedly publicly drawn a line describing what Canada will not accept, even while pursuing the negotiation. Canada will not accept a bad deal, he told provincial leaders roughly a year ago, according to Bloomberg's reporting, a pledge Bloomberg notes he has repeated many times since. Whether the interim agreement now reportedly on the table crosses that line or falls just inside it is ultimately a judgment call Carney and his cabinet will have to make under enormous time pressure, weighing the near-certain economic damage of 50% tariffs hitting on August 19th against the domestic political cost of conceding to demands his own government spent much of the past 18 months publicly resisting. There's also a wider context worth holding on to here, one that CNN's reporting captured clearly back in July. Trump's 50% tariff on Canada was widely read across international trade circles, not just as a Canada-specific dispute, but as a signal to every other country that had assumed the Supreme Court's February ruling meaningfully limited the president's tariff powers going forward. CNN's analysis argued the Canada tariffs demonstrate that even after that legal setback, the administration retained other legal tools, like Section 338 and Section 232, capable of imposing serious economic pressure on individual trade partners. In that sense, whatever happens in these final hours before August 19th will likely be studied closely in capitals well beyond Ottawa, from Brussels to Tokyo to Mexico City, as a test case for how much leverage Washington retains against any government it decides has been treating American exporters unfairly. Before we get to where this leaves things, it's worth being transparent about what remains genuinely uncertain in this story, because a responsible account of an unresolved negotiation has to hold its claims to the same standard the negotiation itself is being held to. The specific contents of the reported interim deal, the steel and aluminum quota framework, the exact dairy licensing concessions, and the full scope of what Canada would give up come from unnamed sources cited by the Globe and Mail and CBC News, and in at least one instance, two separate government sources directly disputed a detail reported elsewhere regarding steel and aluminum quotas. Scaramucci's prediction that Trump will delay or soften the tariffs is his personal opinion, not a confirmed administration plan. And whether talks succeed, fail, or produce a partial or delayed outcome by August 19th simply had not been determined as of this recording. What is confirmed on the record from named sources: the 50% tariffs under Section 338 were formally imposed by presidential proclamation on July 20th, 2026, according to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and confirmed by multiple outlets including Al Jazeera and CNN. They are scheduled to take effect August 19th. They cover close to $20 billion in Canadian goods, according to the USTR's own figures. Dominic LeBlanc has met U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer 4 times in 3 weeks, according to LeBlanc's own office and Reuters reporting. And Prime Minister Carney, as of his most recent public comments reported by Global News, has explicitly declined to guarantee that a comprehensive deal will be finished by the deadline, choosing instead the more cautious language of pursuing pathways toward one. Sources referenced throughout this account include the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, the official White House fact sheet on the Section 338 proclamation, Reuters, the Globe and Mail, CBC News, Global News, Bloomberg, CNN, Al Jazeera, the BBC, and NBC News, along with background context drawn from documented timelines of the broader 2025 to 2026 trade dispute. Where those sources disagreed with one another, particularly around the steel and aluminum quota question, that disagreement has been flagged rather than resolved in favor of either version, because neither has been independently confirmed on the record by a named official. So here is where that leaves the story, sitting right on the edge of a deadline that could go either way. Ottawa is negotiating hard, publicly signaling both flexibility and red lines at the same time. Washington is applying maximum pressure through one of the oldest, least used trade laws on the books, time to land just as talks appear to be accelerating rather than stalling. $20 billion in trade sits exposed. 3 provinces, each with a different economic stake, are watching a federal government try to negotiate concessions that will directly affect their industries and their voters. And a president with a documented pattern of announcing dramatic deadlines that sometimes hold and sometimes don't is once again asking the world to wait and see which version of this story plays out this time. What do you think actually happens here? Does Ottawa manage to land a comprehensive deal before the clock runs out on August 19th? Does the 50% tariff hit as scheduled and force an even harder round of negotiations afterward? Or does Washington do what it has done before and quietly push the deadline back at the last possible moment? If you think Canada is right to hold the line on its dairy and auto industries, even at the risk of these tariffs landing, say so in the comments. And if you think Ottawa should take whatever deal keeps the 50% tariff off the table, make that case too. Because this is exactly the kind of decision where reasonable people watching the same set of facts can land in very different places. Drop your prediction below before the deadline hits, so we can all come back and see who actually called it correctly. And if you want to understand how this dispute reshapes trade relationships well beyond North America, that is a story worth following closely in the weeks after August 19th, whichever way this particular showdown lands. One last honest note before we close. Stories like this one change fast, sometimes within hours, and any number attached to a still-moving negotiation is only as good as the moment it was reported. If you're watching this after August 19th has already come and gone, you likely already know something we don't as of this recording. Whether Ottawa secured its comprehensive deal, whether the 50% tariffs landed as scheduled, or whether Washington pushed the deadline down the road one more time. Either way, the underlying relationship between these two economies, 3/4 of Canadian exports flowing south, integrated supply chains running through Windsor and Detroit, and a dairy, auto, and forestry fight that has outlasted 4 separate deadlines already, isn't going away with a single announcement. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back with the outcome as soon as it's confirmed.